Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Civitas. Today we have an incredibly special episode. We often talk about the crisis of democracy, the rise of populism, and this kind of topics. But today we are talking about how and where the roots of these issues actually lie. Joining us today is one of the world's leading experts in on European political history and democratic stability, professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, Sheri Berman. Professor, it's an absolute honor to have you on Civitas. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Okay, Professor, let's jump straight into the deep end. In modern international relations, there is a dominant assumption that holding free and fair elections is in developing nations is a linear path to stable democracy. But in your work, you remind us that Europe had its own path, and it was absolutely chaotic and bloody. Can you explain why was that?
Well, so yes, as you've said, we tend to kind of look at countries that are democratic today, whether we're talking about Europe or perhaps the United States or Canada or things like that, and sort of assume A, that they've been democratic for, whatever, forever, and B, that it was relatively easy for them to gain that status. And that is not what a study of history shows us. In fact, in almost every country, whether European or the United States, that's where I am, getting to democracy was a very long and often very bloody struggle. So if we take the European cases, for example, it was only in the second half of the 20th century, that is to say, after the Second World War, which still remains the bloodiest war in human history. It was only after that war that Western Europe became stable and democratic. That is to say, that entire part of the continent developed democratic regimes that were relatively stable and well functioning. Up through that period, there had been many transitions to democracy from the French Revolution up through the early 20th century, but most of those democratic experiments were short lived. They collapsed into dictatorship. They did not give us stable political regimes. So really that is a product of the second half of the 20th century. Southern Europe, of course, only became stable democracies later on in the 1970s for the most part. And of course, Eastern Europe only made transitions to democracy with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the United States, we, even Americans, tend to think of our country as always having been democratic. But of course, up through the Civil War, there was a part of the country that was not democratic at all. In fact, it was a racial oligarchy, and we had to fight what remains the bloodiest war in our history, that is to say, the Civil War, the war where more Americans died than in any other war to this day, to get rid of that regime. And then it took another 100 years after our Civil War until full democratic rights were actually enjoyed by African American citizens. So if you look back at the countries that are stable democracies today, or relatively stable, because of course that is very much in question in the United States today, those countries only got there after very long, very bloody, and really quite, as you put it, sort of chaotic in the sense of going back and forth many times. France, which is the home of the French, which was the home of the French Revolution, which most scholars sort of see as the beginning of the modern democratic age, that country's on its fifth republic. And if you know something about French history, even the Fifth Republic doesn't quite capture how tumultuous French political history has been, over that period. So I think it's very important for countries that are still in the midst of trying to figure out how to perhaps achieve democracy today to recognize that even in countries where it exists, it has always been a very, very hard struggle.
You talked about French history. When we had history classes, I always was surprised why France has changed a lot in politics. They had changed their authorities multiple times, and I couldn't get that. But uh, if I read about something that trapped this kind of uh, like this kind of things, it was obvious that it was not intentional.
Well, it wasn't intentional in the sense that I don't think any society sets out to say, okay, look, let's have huge amounts of political instability. The reason for that instability in France, just like the reason for that instability in other countries and in other parts of the world, is that people were not yet united in what they believed the best form of regime was for their particular country, right? So the thing that drove French instability was that up through the second half of the 20th century, there were still many people in France who did not believe democracy was the best form of government, right? Not perfect, right? But as Winston Churchill famously put it, the least bad alternative, right? Now, of course, also in the French case, as in many other countries, there was also the question of external intervention, right? The Third Republic was brought to an end by the invasion from Germany, right? Although, again, for scholars who study that period, by the by the early 1940s, the Third Republic was already very weak, which probably helps to explain why it fell so rapidly to the Nazis. But again, that was an external intervention, and many democratic regimes and other types of independent political regimes are brought to an end by external intervention. But the broader issue, right, is how do countries come to an agreement about what is the best form of politics? I mentioned before the United States. I mean, the problem in the US up through the Civil War was that a significant number of people in this country, concentrated but not exclusively in the American South, simply did not believe that full democracy belonged in their region. They were not willing to give to African Americans full political rights. They saw them as not part of the American people, as not people really at all, and so therefore not deserving of inclusion in a democratic regime. That is essentially what the Civil War was about, right? And so instability is caused by societies that are deeply divided over political and other issues.
We see if democratic elections, like,
I can't, yeah, sorry.
yeah, if we have some elections in like the democratic systems, if they are unfair, what is the meaning of democracy then, right?
Mm-hmm. So, look, when political scientists and others think about how to define democracy, what are its essential characteristics? The first, but not the last thing they focus on are quote unquote free and fair elections, right? Now, that's not
Right.
all that democracy is, but it must have that. So it is necessary, but not sufficient. Now, free and fair is doing a lot of work there, right? Free means that everybody should be allowed, all citizens should be allowed to participate. Free means that the playing field, the competitive field, is open. That is to say, there are opposition parties. Those parties are allowed to organize, they are allowed to get their messages across, they are allowed to raise money or disseminate, sort of their information. And so having free and fair elections, right, is absolutely necessary. Now, lots of places that scholars would not consider to be democratic hold elections, right? There used to be elections, for example, in the former Soviet Union, but those were not real elections in the sense that, right, there was no real opposition. The government controlled all resources, media, civil society. Anybody who was directly opposed to the regime was, disappeared or put in jail. And so that really helps us today when we look around the world. So when scholars, for instance, look at a place like Turkey or Hungary before Viktor Orban's collapse, they look at those places and say, okay, look, there are elections and there are sort of opposition parties, but those opposition parties are severely disadvantaged. The government in a place like Turkey is now even directly jailing opposition. It directly controls the media. It doesn't stop individuals from voting, but it tilts, as I said before, the playing field, the field of political competition in such a way that we can say, again, as scholars and observers, that these are not full democracies, right? But so you start with elections, you look at how free and fair they are, and then you move on to other critical aspects of democracy, individual rights, those kinds of things, rule of law, civilian control of the military, all those kinds of things. But free and fair elections are the place to begin when you're trying to understand what kind of political regime a country has and how, in particular, how democratic it is or is not.
Polarization
I
is
can't hear. I didn't hear the first part of your question.
a question. How can polarization destroy democracy?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, it gets back to something you asked before about why political instability more generally happens, right? So, polarization basically means that citizens are very, very politically divided. Now that's not necessarily a problem. Obviously, in democracy, citizens can have very strong disagreements, right? That's in fact what democracy is all about, right? If citizens didn't disagree, then democracy would be superfluous, right? Democracy is a way of dealing with differences in a peaceful and regularized manner, right? But when those divisions become so deep, and in particular, they become moralized in the sense that citizens are not disagreeing about, okay, look, you have different policy preferences than I do. You like high taxes, I like low taxes. You like a bigger welfare state, I like a smaller welfare state. You like more government, I like less government. Those are kinds of things where people can disagree strongly, but they're not questions about life or death. They're not zero-sum questions. The problem with polarization, as we talk about today, is a question of when societies become so divided over issues where they feel that the stakes, as I said, are very high, or they're zero-sum, which is to say, if you win, I don't only worry, oh my God, I'm going to have to pay higher taxes, or the government's going to be bigger than I like, but I worry that your being in power is going to stop me from being able to live the life that I want. It is going to injure my community, my family, right, in ways that I cannot tolerate, right? That kind of polarization, that kind of deep divisions, in those kind of situations, it is very hard for democracy to function. Democracy, as I said, it requires compromise. It requires bargaining. It requires saying, okay, look, you're going to get a little bit of this. I'm going to get a little bit of that. And that is absolutely essential for democracy. But if you feel like you can't bargain or compromise with your opponent because you are so different on basic fundamental questions, then it becomes very hard for democracy to function. And also, to get back to the question that you asked before, it becomes very hard to accept the outcome of an election, right? If you believe that losing an election is going to threaten you, your family, and your community, then you may very well think, well, maybe it's not such a bad job if my guy or my party actually doesn't really allow free and fair elections, right? So polarization, instability, the questions about acceptance and legitimacy of democracy, these are all really very closely tied up.
Question is that what do you think is the best political regime that many countries in the world can adapt? It depends on the country, I know, but for many countries, which one is the best?
So I am a strong partisan of democracy, not because I think it solves all problems. I'm living in a country where clearly it is not doing that, but simply because, as I kind of mentioned before, it is the least bad alternative, right? Authoritarian regimes are by definition regimes where one person or one group has all the power. And that means not only that the vast majority of citizens generally are not allowed to participate politically in the life of their communities, but it also means that those systems lack the ability to self correct because they are impervious to outside pressure, right? So democracy has both intrinsic and extrinsic advantages, right? The intrinsic advantages, look, there is something I believe morally correct about all people in all places having an ability to participate in the decision making process that determines the development of their societies. But from a practical perspective, right, democracies have the ability to self correct in a way that authoritarian regimes do not. Somebody's doing a bad job, they lose an election. somebody's doing a bad job, other people bring up other policy suggestions. These kinds of things, I think, make democracy, again, not perfect. So judging it against some ideal is both unfair and, sort of, dooming it to sort of look bad. But when you compare it to other types of regimes, it is just much better.
Clearly better, but there is no regime that is 100% the best. You're saying that?
I am saying that while it is very possible for democracy not to do well, if the question is, right, I have country X. I don't know a lot about its culture. I don't know a lot about its history. I don't know a lot about, sort of what part of the world it is. If I'm behind, what philosophers like to call a veil of ignorance, and you say to me, nonetheless, you have to pick a regime for this country, a political regime, I would always pick democracy because it is always, if not perfect, the least bad alternative. There are very few examples, right, of authoritarian regimes that over time outproduce democracies, right? If we take, for instance, the country that is held up as the model authoritarian regime today, right, China, right? There's simply no doubt that China has undergone a world historical economic transformation over the past generation. That is really something that is incredible and that has benefited Chinese citizens, right? Hundreds and hundreds of millions of whom have been transferred out of poverty. But this is the same regime that gave that country the Cultural Revolution and millions of deaths, perhaps even more deaths than caused by Stalin. So I would say over time, right, if I am behind the veil of ignorance, I'd rather a democratic regime than an authoritarian one. And I think that is true overall, not, again, because democracies are perfect, but because they are better than the practical alternatives.
When I was researching, I have come up with your current research called The Political Consequences of Economic Ideas, Neoliberalism, the Left, and the Fate of Democracy. And could you give the audience an exclusive preview? How did the neoliberal economic ideas of the 20th century accidentally trigger the democratic decay we are seeing today?
So this is a book that's focused on Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States, although hopefully it has some broader implications for other parts of the world. And the argument, or one of the arguments in any case, is about, as you said, the sort of negative political consequences of neoliberalism. One thing that made the West so successful during that post-war period, right, was that we had both extraordinarily productive capitalist economies. They delivered us both large amounts of growth and increasing equality. And that was a consequence of the fact that people understood, partially as a reaction to the tragedies of the Great Depression and the interwar period, that if governments were not empowered to control capitalism's negative consequences, its ability to generate crises like the Great Depression, its ability to generate massive amounts of inequality and insecurity, huge amounts of social dislocation, that without government's ability to constrain that, right, you would get growing extremism and therefore growing threats to democracy. That was a lesson that everybody in 1945 on both sides of the Atlantic, in both Western Europe and in the United States, understood. And so we had a very particular relationship between capitalism and democratic governments in those post-war decades. What neoliberalism did was it kind of brought an end to that period, right? There was the idea that the way to go is by freeing markets, by cutting back on governments, by opening up the world to more or less kind of unfettered free trade, by cutting social safety nets. And that had a variety of very bad consequences. The economic consequences we're probably fairly familiar with. We have not had high levels of growth in the West over the past decades. We have had growing inequality and insecurity. We have had extreme differences in development between, sort of relatively successful metropolitan urban areas and increasingly falling behind rural areas. All of these things have done exactly what the architects of the post-war order would have predicted. They have led to growing populism and extremism, growing dissatisfaction with democracy, and even in places like the United States, democratic decay.
Recent episode with Professor Jonathan Barron from University of Pennsylvania. Uh, we talked about the idea of cosmopolitanism. What do you think about this? How can it help? Uh, how can people who think in this way, the politicians who think in this way, can do political actions that can actually change the world and even unite the world?
So some of it sort of depends on how you define cosmopolitanism, right? So, one thing that social scientists have spent a decent bit of time thinking about who study, sort of Europe and North America, right, is that, what has happened over the last, let's say, 2 decades is that highly educated, or let me say college educated voters in Europe and the United States have gotten increasingly what is sometimes referred to as cosmopolitan or progressive or post materialist in their values. What does that mean? They put a lot of emphasis on the environment, they put a lot of emphasis on breaking with traditional values, religious values, traditional gender roles, greater individual freedom, growing attention to the needs of minorities. They favor more open borders, greater levels of immigration, all those kinds of things, right? And they have become far more, whatever, again, you want to call it cosmopolitan, progressive, post materialist on these issues than their non college educated counterparts have. And so what you've seen is a sort of growing divergence in values and priorities within Western societies. And this helps to explain, it's not the only explanation, helps to explain the rise of populism, particularly on the right, but also we have populist parties on the left. And again, a kind of growing resentment among many sectors of the population of kind of, educated elites. And this, again, is sort of part of the dynamics of both populism and democratic decay in the West today.
Thank you. To close our episode, I have the last question. If you had a chance to give one advice to young people who are getting into politics or economy, what would it be?
So I guess the piece of advice would be first, to be involved, right? Like a lot of students who I come across say that they are so upset with the state of the world and they are so upset with how they see the establishment as having screwed up the world that, they don't want to have anything to do with politics at all. I think that that is really both a counterproductive response and also I think kind of sets you out of the political conversation. If you want to complain about things but don't want to do anything about them, then I don't want to hear your complaints, right? But look, so you must be involved, right? If you feel strongly about certain issues, or you feel strongly that the direction of your country has gone in the wrong way, I don't understand how you expect that to change if everyone, including yourself or including oneself, decides to just kind of check out. So you must be involved. Second, you must understand that in the context of democracy, right? If we're talking about democratic systems, right? That sometimes things do not go your way. Majorities have views that you don't like, or the political system seems to have dynamics that sort of thwart your ambitions and your priorities. Again, democracy is about dealing with differences. It is about dealing with divisions and differences in societies. And so if you want to change things, it can be very hard, it can be very frustrating, and it can be very slow. But if you want change and you want that change to be peaceful and you want that change to be enduring, you have no choice but to work within the institutions of democracy. That does not mean that you cannot try to change them, make them more representative, make them more transparent, make them more open. But you must understand that when things don't go your way, that is not a reason for you to sort of throw up your hands and either withdraw or alternatively believe that the only path forward is through radicalism and violence, right? You must persuade your fellow citizens. You must organize your fellow citizens. You must go out there and, to use a phrase, be the change that you want to see. There is simply no other way for progress to be made.
Was an incredible masterclass. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights and showing young people how democracy is changing over the time. Thank you.
My
Bye.
pleasure. Bye-bye. All right. Well, thank you very much.